Excellent. So, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be the exact opposite of Jeff, and I'm a bit of a hive of energy, I'm afraid. But something Jeff talked about is our own experiences, and this is effectively me sharing my own experiences. So I'd like to talk about something called the gift of material reasoning, and why thinking outside the box isn't enough. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Well, let's just introduce what material reasoning might be. I'd like you to do me a favor, and I'd like you to imagine something. I'd like you to imagine, if you can, that you are sitting on a beam of light. And as you're sitting on this beam of light, I'd like you to look all around you and ask yourself, what can you see? Can you see the other light particles, light waves, or light beams? And if you can, what are they doing? So what do they look like? Are they particles? Are they waves? Are they beams? Are they glowing? Are they perfectly still in relationship to you, or are they shooting off in different directions? Are they vibrating? What are they doing? Well, this very famously was a thought experiment conducted by the world-famous dyslexic Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein, famously again, was said to be one of the greatest material reasoners. He used this thought experiment and others to come up with his theory of general relativity. And it's a great example of material reasoning. So we asked, what is material reasoning? And I'm going to give you two very simple answers. The first answer is material reasoning is the ability to visualize and to navigate visual images in the imagination. So I'm going to give you an example of what that means. I'm going to allow you to do a little bit of visual reasoning. So I'm going to show you an image of 9 dots. Very, very famous little test, this. Very famous little test. If you don't know it, don't worry, but have a go with it anyway. Imagine these 9 dots, and then imagine how many lines it would take to join these 9 dots together with as few lines as possible, and the lines have got to be straight and unbroken. So straight lines, unbroken. What's the fewest number of straight lines it would take to join these 9 dots together? Just imagine that. Now, once you've come up with your best guess, I'm not going to ask everyone to give me their answers because there's quite a few of you here and it might take a little while. So once you've come up with your best guess, perhaps it looks a little bit like this. Now, if it does, this is what we call out-of-the-box thinking, because what you have to do, in order to do it with as few straight lines as possible, you have to go outside the box. And that's what they mean by out-of-the-box thinking. Interestingly, those people who have the gift of material reasoning, they can go one better, and we'll come to it in a minute. So we'll think about this, park it here, and we'll come back to it a little bit later on. The second example of what material reasoning is, the second definition, it is the ability to imagine an object or visualize a concept and then manipulate that image in your mind through more than 2 dimensions. Something a little bit like this. I love making GIFs. This one took me forever. So, I remember bashing my head against the wall trying to do this one. This is the idea of somebody manipulating an object or even a concept in his or her brain through more than 2 dimensions, 3-dimensional manipulation. And of course we know that manipulating an object in your brain through more than 3 dimensions and navigating through the object in your mind is actually very similar. They go hand in hand. And so this is what material reasoning is. It's the ability to be able to visualize and manipulate concepts and images in your brain. Why am I talking about it? Well, Jeff talks about your own story. I'm dyslexic. I had the worst time at school you can imagine. I've been talking to a few people, and the universal experience of school for people with dyslexia is torture, it's pain, it's humiliating, it's degrading. It destroys you as a human being, quite frankly. But we know from sociological, psychological, scientific, and empirical studies that people with dyslexia have got this gift of material reasoning. They've got this gift of material reasoning. Let's just have a very quick look, at why we know this. Well, about a year and a half ago, an organization called Dyslexic Advantage produced a survey, and they surveyed over 1,000 people, 1,100 people, and they asked a simple question. When I view 3D spatial images in my mind, I can manipulate them and see them from multiple angles, true or false. The dyslexic samples on the left, the non-dyslexic samples on the right. And you'll see that, that the dyslexics strongly disagree, about 5% of them, and it goes up to agree, strongly agree, 42.47%. On the other side, the non-dyslexic samples strongly disagree and disagree with 25% and 35%, and strongly agree went down to 6%. Dyslexic and non-dyslexic participants and respondents were the exact opposite of each other. Now, this isn't the only test that's been done on material reasoning. There have been a number of other tests that have been done on material reasoning. I'm going to give you a little bit more evidence. This is quite interesting. James Russell, the inventor of the compact disc, the dyslexic inventor of the compact disc, said that he was able to design his inventions in vivid detail in his mind, running experiments on them before he even picked up a tool. Mark Rowe, the dyslexic surgeon, would do surgery in his mind with different techniques until he decided what was the best. And we know that a dyslexic advantage was found for holistic visualization. Now, here's a wonderful quotation. I'm going to quote this, I love it. The entities which seem to serve as elements in my thoughts are more or less clear images, which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined. This combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought. The elements are of a visual type. And this is what Albert Einstein said. We know that there's a substantial body of findings in psychological literature showing that dyslexics are likely to have high levels of visuospatial ability, and individuals with dyslexia excel when global, holistic visual spatial skills are tested. If you want the references to this, I've provided a couple on these slides, but at the end of the slideshow, I've provided a full list of references for the research that I've done on this material reasoning. Okay, so why is it? Why is it that that's the case? Now, what I'd like you to do, you can, if you have a paper and pencil, I'd like you to do something. If you don't have a paper and pencil, use your material reasoning skills and imagine this. I'd like you to draw two brains. One brain, like the one on the screen at the moment, is made up entirely of triangles. The other brain will be made up entirely of squares. So I'd like you to draw two brains, one made up entirely of triangles and one made up entirely of squares. I'm going to give you 20 to 30 seconds to do this, so don't spend a lot of time. Thank you. Go. Hopefully you can still see me. Click that just so that you can. Okay, now you've done this. I'm going to start sharing the screen again. Hopefully, share. Here we go. Right. So now you've drawn your brains. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to join the corners of these brains together. Okay, so join the corners of the triangles to other triangle corners. So within each brain, join the corners of the geometric shapes together. So you join the corners of the triangles to other triangles. On the other brain, join the corners of the squares to other squares. A little bit like I've done here. Okay? Don't take too long to do it, but what you'll notice, as you're doing it, you will notice that it is impossible, it is physically impossible that the straight lines joining the corners of the triangles to the corners of the triangles, and the straight lines joining the corners of the squares to the corners of the squares go in the same direction. It is physically impossible for them to go in the same direction. Now, what you've just done is you have effectively drawn neural pathways. Because neural pathways are physical things, effectively. They follow the contours of the actual shape of the brain, the ventral pathways and the mini columns within the brain. So when the brain is shaped slightly differently, the neural pathways are necessarily different. And what that means is the dyslexic brain is shaped slightly differently from the non-dyslexic brain. The neural pathways will therefore necessarily be different. The way that dyslexic brains process information is therefore necessarily different. In other words, dyslexic people, neurologically, we have to think differently from non-dyslexic people. That's who we are. We cannot help ourselves. We have to think differently. There's a lot of research explaining this. A lady called Dr. Beverly Stafer, a chartered psychologist and neuropsychologist, and an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society showed clearly that different brain structures within the dyslexic brain mean that dyslexic people mentally model concepts, perceive patterns, and have a multidimensional perspective, which means that they conceive and build models, they solve complex puzzles, and they can imagine, structure, and create in a way that others can't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you very quickly, I'm going to show you a dyslexic brain. Do not do this at home, okay? I'm very dyspraxic, so if I chop my own hands off, this is going to be a terrible, terrible end to the conference. But here we go. Okay, what we have. Yay, I've got the brain. I have dissected the brain. This is the right hemisphere of the brain. And inside the right hemisphere of the brain, this here is what we call the hippocampus. Okay, now I'm going to concentrate on the right hemisphere and the hippocampus of the brain. And these two are very important points because we know that the right hemisphere in the dyslexic brain and the hippocampus are slightly different from the non-dyslexic brain. What do I mean when I say that? Well, the right hemisphere of the brain is responsible for, the hippocampus is responsible for memory. Studies show both long-term and short-term memory. And it's responsible for the visual representations of spatiotemporal concepts. It seems that a difference in the hippocampus of the dyslexic brain involves a trade-off in terms of cognitive skills. So on the one hand, short-term working memory seems to suffer, where on the other hand, there's a marked increase in the ability to conceptualize and visualize objects and ideas, and then to manipulate. Material reasoning, in other words. The right hemisphere of the brain is, and I know this is a lot more complex, and I'm laying it out. There's a lot of complexity and interrelation, I know that. But the right hemisphere of the brain essentially is the motor room, the engine room for visualization, types of creativity, holistic thinking, and imagination. And research has shown that the right hemisphere of the dyslexic brain is actually larger than the right hemisphere of the non-dyslexic brain. And again, there are trade-offs involved in having differently balanced hemispheres. Have a look at something called the hemispheric balance theory of dyslexia. It's really, really interesting. One of the downsides is the difficulty in making the transition from simply recognizing word shapes to decoding the sounds of words. But the upside appears to be the increased ability in material reasoning. And these things going together produce this. Duranovic, Dajdic, and Gavic, forgive my pronunciation, please forgive my pronunciation. These scientists assessed whether students with dyslexia exhibited superior visualization strategies in comparison to the average non-dyslexic students. In one such test, the paper folding test, participants were required to predict how a piece of paper would look after it had been folded, punched with a hole, and unfolded once again. Duranovic et al. Identified higher analytic and mental visualization techniques among students with dyslexia than non-dyslexic students. So we're going to have a look at that. I'm going to take you back to these 9 dots, okay? And I'm going to ask you to imagine one more thing. I'd like you to imagine you've been kidnapped by aliens, okay? And you wake up in a strange alien sphere. And you know you're inside a sphere because there's a measuring rod, and you touch the measuring rod to the walls of the sphere, and it's concave all the way around you. And you think, oh, I've got to get out of it. So you smash your way through the wall of this sphere, and you climb out, and you're standing on the sphere, and you can measure the convex nature of the floor that you're standing on. You know that it's a sphere. But you look up, and oh my goodness, you're surrounded by another sphere. But strangely, when you put the measuring rod on that sphere, it rolls like it's convex. And all around you, it rolls like it's convex. And you jump onto the sphere. Look back at the first sphere that you came from, and that first sphere is surrounding you at every point. What could this mean? You've got 2 spheres that seem to surround each other. Well, in my little video to introduce the topic, I talked about Immanuel Kant and 2 hands. Now, Immanuel Kant was a very clever man, and he realized that he had 2 hands. This is why we know he was so clever. But he realized that the angle between the index finger and the thumb on one hand was the same as the angle between the index finger and the thumb on the other hand. The angle between the little finger and the thumb on each hand was the same. The angle between the index finger and the middle finger on each hand was the same. So his hands were geometrically identical, but they were physically opposite. You couldn't fill the space of one hand using the physical form of the other hand. And he realized when he did this, that when you describe an object, you're describing the object geometrically or spatially, but the two are not always the same. Now that's where the solution to this 9-dot challenge comes. When I was first shown it and somebody showed me the answer, the out-of-the-box thinking, my brain initially went, I don't believe it, I don't buy that, I think you can do it better. And in my brain, what I did is I folded the paper. I was still doing it according to the test in 2 dimensions, but physically I was folding it. And I was folding it, and I was folding it, and I was folding it. So here we have my version. And I folded it, and I folded it, and I folded it, and I folded it. And when I folded it, I found I was able to put a single straight line through every single one of the dots. And that is what material reasoning is. It's the ability to imagine how you can do things differently just by manipulating objects and ideas in your mind. So what we know is we know what material reasoning is. We know from empirical study that dyslexic people are very good at material reasoning. We also know from scientific studies that dyslexic people have to materially reason. That's how their brains think. Okay, if we don't allow them this material reasoning, they're going to find school really, really terrible. So how can we do this so that we can grab dyslexic students at school? Well, it's very easy. One of the things we can do, we can use games and puzzles. We can use Duplo or Lego. You can use magnetic building games and activities. Jigsaw learning is brilliant. Lots of cards with different concepts on them. And you can rearrange them and arrange them in your mind or on a desk or something to re-examine these concepts and to see how they work and how they fit together. This is deep learning. Anybody who's ever looked at things like Bloom's taxonomy will realize that this is really deep learning. It's higher order thinking skills. Construction and deconstruction activities, building and taking things apart. This kind of thing. On the outside, let me explain a couple of these things. Creating infographics. If anybody's ever seen my LinkedIn page, you know how much in love I am with infographics. And infographics can explain difficult concepts very easily without the need for a lot of literacy. And without the need for understanding, reading it and writing it. So you can create infographics using this gift of material reasoning. Again, this is deep, deep learning. Mind mapping. Really interestingly, after the 9/11 attacks in America, Lower Manhattan was redesigned using mind maps. And these mind maps would allow people to include complex information in a very simple form. And after the reconstruction of Lower Manhattan, the mind maps went into the Museum of Modern Art. They're so, so good. Escape rooms, if it's appropriate, take people to escape rooms or create one in your own classroom. How do you get out of this situation? Here's a problem. Imagine how you can get out of this situation, then do it. Drawing and redrawing visual models of concepts. We'll come to this in a second. Planning using visuals. Minecraft. Now, I actually know one geography teacher who spent an entire semester teaching geography through the medium of Minecraft. It was wonderful. She was sharing her experiences with me as she was doing it. It was the most wonderful, wonderful thing. And interactive learning websites such as coolmathgames.com. If you want to check out a website, that's a really good website. Now, going back, I said creating infographics and drawing and redrawing visual models of concepts. What can that mean? Well, here's a very good example. A few years ago, I was teaching English to a Swiss man, and he was in his late 40s, and he'd been trying to learn English for nearly 40 years, and he couldn't. He was dyslexic, and he couldn't learn it. He didn't understand English. He didn't understand how it worked. And in our first week together, because we're only together for 2 weeks, and on day 2 or something, he said to me, Martin, I don't get it. What does English look like? What does English grammar look like? And I thought, what a wonderfully dyslexic question to ask. This is a perfect question for material reasoning. So together, we drew English grammar, and it was obvious. Okay, English grammar is easy, by the way. For anybody who's ever learned English, you'd probably disagree with me. But English grammar is relatively easy. Subject and object is more or less what you've got. And then you've got this. We drew English grammar. Here is the shape of English grammar. And on here, we have the past, the present, and the future. And inside the past, the present, and the future, you have a triangle. Okay? And you can turn and manipulate this triangle. And this triangle represents the simple, the perfect, and the continuous. Okay? So this triangle represents the simple, the perfect, and the continuous. And as long as you know what the perfect does, you take a standpoint and you look back in time. I have been to Australia, something like that. So as long as you know what the perfect does and you know how to construct it, I, subject plus have plus the past participle, I have been, I have eaten, I have seen. Then you know that the present perfect is I have eaten, but the past perfect would be I had eaten, and the future perfect would be I will have eaten. Something like that. Well, take the continuous. You know what it does. It describes temporary short-term activities. We know how to create it. The verb to be plus ing. I am eating. So the present continuous is I am eating. The past is I was eating. The future is I will be eating. Now, you can therefore manipulate this triangle through the circle. So the continuous touches the present, I am eating, or it touches the future, I will be eating. You can manipulate it so the perfect and the continuous both touch the present, I have been eating. The past and the perfect and the continuous touch the past, I had been eating. The perfect and the continuous touch the future, I will have been eating. Now, it might not speak to you so much, but I can tell you this, simply by drawing and creating a visual model of English grammar. This man, he suddenly said, I get it, I understand it now, I see how English works. And he came to love English. He came to love English grammar. Because suddenly he saw how it works and he saw how simple it is. Essentially, it's a very, very simple thing indeed. And so when we talk about drawing and redrawing visual models of concepts, almost anything can be drawn. Almost anything can be modeled, and you can turn them into infographics, or you can mind map them. Now, we've seen that material reasoning is effectively the ability to visualize and conceptualize and manipulate ideas and concepts in your mind. We've seen that people with dyslexia do that naturally. The empirical data says so, the psychological data says so, and the scientific research says so. We know that people with dyslexia, that's how we think. We can't help it. We also know that you can use all sorts of techniques in the class to teach material reasoning. Now, let me tell you this. Let me go back to my own experiences. When I was at school, they never did this. No one ever did this, and school was the worst experience of my life. I look back on it, and I tremble when I look back on school. It was humiliating, degrading, difficult, suffocating, painful. But it's not because I'm not able to learn, because I'm currently doing my doctorate. I'm close to the end of my doctorate. So it's not that I'm unable to learn, it's that I was unable to learn using the techniques that they were using on me. And we know that that wasn't just my childhood, way, way, way back in history. We know that that's still true. The British Dyslexia Association did a study, and they found that over 84% of teachers found it hard to impossible to identify dyslexia. We also know that if you're dyslexic, you have a 600% raised likelihood, that is effectively you're 6 times more likely to drop out of school if you're dyslexic. And there is a 61% chance of school exclusions if you're dyslexic. So 61% of school exclusions are to do with dyslexia, mainly dyslexia. It says in other special educational needs, but mainly dyslexia, this study showed. So we know that this is happening now. And we also know from a survey that was done very, very recently again by the British Dyslexia Association, 95% of parents worry about their dyslexic child's future at school. 76% of parents felt schools did not do enough to support their dyslexic child. 72% of parents felt school did not nurture their dyslexic child's potential and ability. On the other side of this, if you look at the right-hand side, 52% of dyslexic children try to avoid school because of their dyslexia, and 47% of dyslexic children drop out of high school because their dyslexia is not taken into account. This is huge. This is really, really huge. If we continue teaching the way we have taught, we will continue to create this social earthquake. We will continue to create this black hole where dyslexic children fall down the black hole because they are unable to think the way they want to think. They're being taught in ways they cannot think. And all we have to do is understand material reasoning just a little bit better than we currently do. Now, I only have a couple of minutes to finish this, so I'm going to put this into a global context. One of the reasons this is so important, let's look at this in a global context. One of the reasons it's so important, the International Dyslexia Association. In fact, one of my particular interests is different organizations in different nations measure dyslexia differently. There is no single measurement for how many dyslexic people there are in the world. But the International Dyslexia Association puts it at something like 15% of the world's population is dyslexic. 15% of the world's population. That means 15% of your class, by the way. 15% of the kids in your school are dyslexic. Possibly 15% of the teachers that you work with are dyslexic. Let's put this into global terms. 15% of the population is the combined total of the entire population of Brazil, the entire population of the United States, the entire population of Nigeria, the entire population of Russia, the entire population of Japan, and the entire population of the United Kingdom combined. That's what 15% of the population is. We are failing these kids. I dropped out of school, then I went back, and I dropped out, then I went back, and I dropped out, then I went back, because I was determined to succeed. But I know of so many kids who didn't. And the figures of dyslexia and homelessness and mental health problems are staggering. If we as teachers don't realize that all we have to do is understand what material reasoning is, and understand you can teach using material reasoning, you can teach grammar using material reasoning, you can teach almost anything using material reasoning. If we as teachers understand that that's all we have to do, we can save 15% of the population from the kind of hell